Welcome back to Wisdom Unveiled. Glad you could join us again. As you know, we're taking a deep dive into the works of Saadi. And last time we talked about humility.
Yes, we did.
But there's so much more to uncover.
Oh, yeah.
And today I thought it'd be interesting to explore this kind of paradox in his teachings.
Okay.
Where he talks about how our inner selves and outward actions can sometimes be totally different.
Yeah, it's a theme that really runs throughout his work, this idea that, he's constantly challenging us to really look at our motivations and to question whether we're really, kind of walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Yeah. And, before we get too far into this, just a quick reminder to everyone that, what we're looking at are translations of conversations with Iranian philosophers. Yeah. So there's always that challenge of, are we getting all the nuances?
It's the nature of working with these kinds of texts.
Exactly. But that's what makes it so fascinating.
Yeah.
So, okay, I always love to start with a good story. And Saadi was a master storyteller. And there's this one story that really struck me about a man who refused to sweep a mosque because he felt unworthy. And it's almost like counterintuitive, right? You would think helping out would be like the humble thing to do.
It's a great example of how he uses these simple stories to really kind of challenge assumptions. So on the surface, the guy refusing to sweep, it seems humble, right? But Saadi is inviting us to look deeper and say, well, what's the motivation? Is it really about humility, or is it about wanting to appear pious?
Yeah. So you could be putting on like this big show of being humble, but inside you're driven by ego. It's like, that saying, actions speak louder than words. But in this case, the inaction is speaking volumes.
Absolutely. And he has a word for this disconnect between our inner state and our outer actions. It's pollution.
Pollution.
Yeah. He's not talking about like environmental pollution. He's talking about this kind of spiritual pollution.
Wow.
That arises when we're not true to ourselves.
Pollution. That's a strong word. What makes this kind of disconnect so serious for Saadi?
Well, for Saadi, hypocrisy, which is essentially what this is a major offense. He even says that the stench of hypocrisy can reach the heavens.
Wow. Okay, so my little white lies pretending to be something I'm not.
Yeah.
That's not just like a personal flaw. That's like a cosmic issue.
From Saadi's perspective, absolutely. He sees that this disharmony within ourselves has this ripple effect. It erodes trust, it spreads misinformation, and ultimately it kind of weakens the fabric of society.
Okay, I'm starting to see the gravity of this. It's like my hypocrisy isn't just about me. It's contributing to a bigger problem.
Exactly. Saadi is calling for us to be more self-aware, to examine our motives, and to make sure that our actions are aligned with our values. And he uses this really fascinating metaphor to illustrate this internal struggle. It's the metaphor of dust and fire.
Oh, yeah. The dust and fire thing, I've always been intrigued by that. What's the deeper meaning there?
Well, it's a beautiful way to understand the duality of human nature. So the dust represents our pure original state, and the fire symbolizes all the forces within us, our passions, our desires, our ego.
So are you saying that Saadi believes that we're born good, like pure like dust, and then we get kind of corrupted by the fire of our desires?
It's not quite as simple as that. The fire isn't inherently bad. Remember, fire can also represent creativity, passion, drive.
Right.
These are the things that give us energy and purpose.
Okay, so it's not about extinguishing the fire.
No.
It's about learning to kind of harness it, to use it wisely.
Absolutely.
But how do we make sure that these powerful forces within us don't lead us astray? How do we connect with that pure essence that Saadi describes as dust?
I think that's where free will comes in. Saadi believed that we have a choice.
Yeah.
We're not just puppets of our desires.
Yeah.
We can actively choose how we respond to those forces within us.
So it's not about suppressing our desires. It's about becoming more aware of them, understanding their influence, and choosing how we act in response.
Yeah. You're getting it. And Saadi has another powerful metaphor that speaks to this process of self-discovery. It's the idea of polishing the mirror of the heart.
Oh, I love that metaphor. Can you remind me what that signifies?
Yeah, it's about cultivating self-awareness. It's about clearing away those clouds of ego and desire so that we can see ourselves more clearly. Think about it. If your mirror is covered in dust, you can't see your reflection accurately.
Yeah, that makes sense. So to cultivate humility, we need to start by getting real with ourselves, recognizing our flaws and doing the work to improve.
That's the heart of it. It's about acknowledging our strengths and weaknesses without judgment.
Yeah.
And constantly striving for growth.
But if we can't even see ourselves clearly, how can we expect to act with humility? It makes you wonder how much self-deception is out there.
Probably more than we realize, especially in a world that often rewards outward displays of piety or virtue rather than genuine inner transformation.
Yeah, it's like all that glitters is not gold. We could be easily fooled by appearances, both in ourselves and in others.
That's why Saadi's teachings are so timely. He's urging us to go deeper, to cultivate a humility that's rooted in sincerity, not just appearances.
Yeah. This is really shifting my perspective on humility. It's not passive. It's about active self-reflection and making conscious choices.
Absolutely. And remember that story about the man at the mosque? It wasn't about sweeping. It was about his heart. He was holding himself to a higher standard, refusing to do something that looked humble.
Yeah.
If it wasn't coming from a genuine place.
So he was challenging himself to make sure his intentions were pure.
Yes.
He wasn't just going through the motions for show.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's a powerful reminder that outward actions can be misleading.
They can, and that's why self-knowledge is so important. Saadi's constantly encouraging us to examine our motivations, to ask ourselves, why am I doing this? Is it coming from my best self, or am I trying to impress others?
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in appearances, especially with social media these days. Everyone's curating this perfect image of themselves.
Absolutely. It's like we're encouraged to be humble about our achievements while simultaneously highlighting them for validation. It's a strange paradox.
Right. So it's not about getting praise for being humble. It's about actually being humble even when no one's watching. And that's tough.
It is true. Humility isn't about performing for an audience. It's about aligning our actions with our values, even when it's difficult.
And speaking of difficult, there's this one Saadi quote that really stuck with me. He said, "Whoever adorns himself with humility for people, his humility is arrogance."
That's powerful. It's reminding us that even appearing humble can be a form of pride. It's like we're using humility as a costume to gain social approval.
It's such a subtle trap.
Yeah.
It makes me think of another concept. Saadi talks about this idea that we have two selves within us, the self of proximity and the self of distance. Could you tell me more about that?
Absolutely. It's really key to understanding this whole humility thing. So the self of proximity, that's the part of us that's closest to truth, our pure essence. It's the part that seeks connection, meaning virtue. The things that are truly fulfilling.
So like our best selves.
Yes.
The part of us that's aligned with our values.
You could say that. It's the self that's drawn to what's good and true. And then there's the self of distance, which is all about ego desires, worldly attachments. It's focused on appearances, what other people think, wanting more stuff, more status.
Okay. So it sounds like an inner battle between our higher self and our lower self.
Right.
And I guess humility is about choosing to listen to that higher self.
You're exactly right. And Saadi believes that the more we connect with our self of proximity, the further we move from that self of distance, the more we align with our true essence, the more naturally humble we become.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
The less we focus on ego, the more space we have for genuine humility. But is there a danger in focusing too much on the self of proximity?
That's a good question. What do you mean?
Like, could it lead to spiritual bypassing? Where we're so focused on being good that we ignore real-world problems or even our own flaws.
That's a very insightful point. I think it's definitely about balance. Saadi emphasizes self-awareness, not denial.
Right.
Recognizing our flaws is part of polishing that mirror. We don't pretend to be perfect. We acknowledge our imperfections while striving to act from our best selves.
Okay. So how do we nurture that self of proximity, that truer version of ourselves, without falling into that spiritual bypassing trap?
Well, it's a lifelong journey, but Saadi offers some guidance. He emphasizes self-reflection, examining our motivations, and surrounding ourselves with people who embody the virtues we aspire to.
So it's about being intentional with our thoughts, our actions, and even our relationships, choosing what we focus on and who we spend time with. This all makes me think back to the story of the man refusing to sweep the mosque. Does that relate to the self of proximity and all that?
Absolutely. It's a perfect example of this inner struggle.
Yeah.
So on the surface, refusing to sweep might seem humble,
Right.
but Saadi's suggesting it's actually the self of distance at work.
Really? I'm not sure I follow.
He's more concerned with his perceived unworthiness than with actually serving a higher purpose. He's letting his ego dictate his actions, even if it looks humble on the outside.
Ah, so his ego is calling the shots, even if it looks like he's being humble.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's why self-knowledge is so vital.
Mm-hmm.
We need to recognize the difference between actions coming from our of proximity versus our self of distance.
It's like we're constantly being challenged to check our motives and make sure we're acting from a place of genuine humility, not just putting on a show.
That's it. It's a constant process of discernment, asking ourselves, where is this action coming from? What's the underlying intention?
Which brings us to the question, how do we even define humility? It's not just about what we do, it's about the state of our hearts.
Exactly. You can't just go through the motions. You have to cultivate that inner alignment.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. The dangers of hypocrisy, the importance of self-awareness, and this constant striving to align our inner selves with our outward actions. But where does the concept of others fit into all of this? Is humility just about personal development, or is there a social dimension as well?
That's a great question, and one that Saadi addresses directly in his teachings. He emphasizes that true humility is not just about our individual journey, it's about recognizing our interconnectedness, seeing ourselves as part of a larger whole.
So it's not about putting ourselves down or thinking less of ourselves.
Right.
It's about seeing ourselves as part of something bigger, something that extends beyond our individual ego.
Exactly. And that recognition naturally leads to a sense of humility. It's not about self-deprecation.
Right.
It's about raising others up, recognizing the worth of every person, regardless of their background or social status.
It's about understanding that we're all in this together, that we're all part of the human family.
Beautifully said. And this brings us back to that idea of active humility we were discussing earlier. It's not about passivity or self-effacement. It's about actively engaging with the world in a way that embodies compassion, service, and interconnectedness.
It's about using our gifts and talents to make a positive difference.
Yes.
To contribute to the well-being of others. It's about showing up, being present, and acting with kindness and generosity.
You got it. And it's about shifting the focus from me to we. It's about realizing that true fulfillment doesn't come from just looking out for ourselves, but from contributing to something larger than ourselves.
It's about expanding that circle of compassion.
Yes.
Moving from self-concern to concern for others, for our communities, and ultimately for all of humanity.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It's about recognizing that our well-being is intertwined with the well-being of others.
This conversation has been so insightful. I'm starting to see how Saadi's teachings on humility are not just about personal growth, but about creating a more just and harmonious world. But before we go any further, I think we need a moment to let all of this sink in.
I agree. There's a lot to unpack here, and it's important to give ourselves time to reflect on what we've learned. You know, as we've been talking about humility and this interconnectedness, I keep thinking about another fascinating concept from Saadi that kind of relates to this.
Oh, yeah. I'm all ears. What is it?
Well, it has to do with this idea that, you know, our state of being isn't always constant. Saadi talks about how our connection to our true selves can kind of fluctuate.
That makes sense. I mean, I know for me, there are days where I feel more grounded and connected, and then other days I feel kind of scattered and disconnected.
Exactly. And Saadi connects these shifts to how aligned we are with that self of proximity we were talking about earlier. He says the more connected we are to our true essence, the more likely we are to experience a state he calls tajalli.
Tajalli. That sounds intriguing. What does that mean?
It's a beautiful word. It signifies this moment of revelation, a glimpse of divine light or truth. It's like a sudden flash of insight or understanding, a moment where we feel deeply connected to something greater than ourselves.
Wow. So it's like those moments where everything just clicks and you feel this sense of peace or even joy for no apparent reason, like when you're walking in nature and suddenly you feel this profound sense of awe and wonder.
Precisely. And Saadi suggests that these moments of tajalli aren't random. They're more likely to occur when we're living in alignment with our self of proximity, when our actions are guided by our values and we're acting from a place of genuine humility.
So the more humble we are, the more open we become to these moments of insight and connection. It's fascinating. But what happens when we're not so humble? Is there like an opposite state to tajalli?
There is. He refers to it as istar, which describes the state of being veiled or hidden. It's like being shrouded in a fog where our vision is clouded and we struggle to connect with truth.
So if tajalli is like a light bulb moment, is tajalli is more like stumbling around in the dark, bumping into things?
That's a great analogy. It's a state of confusion where we're more likely to be driven by ego, by desires, by those things that pull us away from our true selves.
It makes sense. When we're caught up in ego and self-interest, we kind of lose sight of the bigger picture.
Yeah.
We get stuck in our own limited perspective.
You're exactly right. And Saadi makes this really interesting observation about this dynamic between tajalli and istar. He says that even the most enlightened individuals, those who are deeply connected to their self of proximity, still experience these shifts. It's not about achieving some permanent state of enlightenment, but about navigating those fluctuations with awareness.
So even the wisest, most humble people have moments where they feel lost or disconnected. That's actually kind of comforting. It makes this whole journey of self-discovery feel less daunting.
It is. He reminds us that we're all human. We all experience ups and downs. It's part of the journey. The key is to not get discouraged by those moments of a star, but to see them as opportunities for growth.
So instead of beating ourselves up when we're feeling lost or out of alignment, we can use those experiences to learn and reconnect with our true selves.
Exactly. And to illustrate this process, he uses the analogy of the human heart as a mirror.
Oh, right. I remember this one, the polishing the mirror of the heart metaphor.
Yes. But this time, he takes it a step further. He says that our experiences, both positive and negative, are like dust that accumulates on that mirror.
Okay.
Obscuring our vision.
Okay, I can see where he's going with this. So our mistakes, negative thoughts, moments of ego, all of that contributes to the dust buildup on our heart's mirror.
Precisely. And the more dust accumulates, the harder it becomes to see clearly, to connect with our true selves, to experience those moments of tajalli.
So what do? Just accept that our mirrors are going to get dusty over time? Or is there something we can do to kind of prevent that buildup?
He emphasizes the importance of actively polishing that mirror. And the way we do that is through self-reflection, through examining our thoughts, our actions, and our motivations.
So it's an ongoing process of cleaning and clearing. Noticing when things are getting dusty and taking steps to kind of wipe the slate clean.
You got it. And each time we polish that mirror, we gain a clearer understanding of ourselves, our strengths and weaknesses, the areas where we need to grow.
I'm sensing a theme here. A lot of Saadi's teachings seem to come back to self-awareness.
Absolutely. It's foundational. Without self-awareness, it's difficult to cultivate humility, to make choices aligned with our values, or to connect with that self-proximity.
It makes me wonder how we actually develop self-awareness. Is it something we're born with, or can it be learned?
It's a bit of both. I think we all have the capacity for self-awareness, but it often needs to be cultivated. And Saadi suggests a few practices that can help us develop this essential skill.
Like what?
Well, one practice is being mindful of our thoughts and actions. It's about paying attention to what's going on inside, noticing our patterns of behavior, our recurring thoughts, and our emotional reactions.
So instead of just going through life on autopilot, we become more present, more aware of what's happening in our inner world.
Exactly. And another practice he emphasizes is seeking guidance from those who are wiser than us. This could be a spiritual teacher, a mentor, or even a friend, anyone who embodies the qualities we admire.
It's like having someone hold up a mirror to us, someone who can see things we might not be able to see in ourselves.
That's a great way to put it. That outside perspective can be incredibly valuable in our journey of self-discovery.
This is making me realize that cultivating humility is a lot more work than I initially thought. It's not just about being nice or putting others first. It's about this deep inner work, this constant process of polishing that mirror of the heart.
You're absolutely right. It's a lifelong journey, and there's no finish line. But Saadi assures us that the rewards are well worth the effort. He says that true humility leads to a state of inner peace and contentment that can't be found anywhere else.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, when we're aligned with our true selves, when our actions reflect our values, there's a sense of peace that comes from knowing we're living authentically.
Exactly. And that alignment, that's where the real magic happens. That's where we tap into our full potential and become a force for good in the world.
This conversation has been so insightful. I feel like I'm starting to grasp the depth of Saadi's wisdom on humility. But before we dive into the practical applications of his teachings, I think we need a moment to let all this soak in.
I agree. There's a lot to ponder here, and it's important to give ourselves time to reflect on what resonates most deeply.
It really is amazing how you were talking about these profound concepts like tajalli and istar and the importance of, constantly polishing that mirror of the heart. It strikes me how relevant Saadi's wisdom is to our lives even today.
Absolutely. I mean, he was writing centuries ago, but his insights into human nature and the path to a more fulfilling life are just incredibly timely.
Especially in today's world, where we're just constantly bombarded with messages that prioritize ego and self-promotion. Like, humility can almost feel like a weakness.
Yeah, it's true. We're surrounded by all these influences that encourage us to focus outward on appearances and achievement. But, Saadi reminds us that true strength comes from cultivating humility, not from feeding our egos.
Yeah, it's about choosing a different path, one that's less about external validation and more about inner alignment, about serving something greater than ourselves.
Beautifully said. And Saadi doesn't just tell us why humility is important. He also provides some really practical guidance on how to actually cultivate it.
Okay, I'm all ears. So how do we actually bring these ancient teachings into our modern lives? It can feel kind of daunting sometimes.
Well, it starts with recognizing that humility isn't just a concept. It's a practice. We cultivate it through conscious choices, through daily efforts to align our actions with our values.
So it's not about reaching some perfect state of humility.
Right.
It's about making choices that move us in the right direction.
Exactly.
It's about that constant polishing, right?
Exactly. It's a journey worth taking, even with the stumbles along the way. And, the more we practice, the more natural it becomes.
This is inspiring, but I need specifics. What are some tangible things we can do to bring more humility into our lives? How do we move from theory to action?
Well, Saadi offers some great guidance. He talks about being mindful of our speech, being quick to listen and slow to speak. He stresses the importance of practicing gratitude, recognizing and appreciating what we have, instead of focusing on what we lack.
So it's not just about grand gestures, but those small, everyday choices we make in how we interact with others and how we approach the world.
Exactly. Being present, being attentive to the needs of others, offering support without expecting anything in return.
It reminds me of something you said earlier about shifting the focus from me to we.
Yes. That shift in perspective is really at the heart of Saadi's teachings on humility. It's about recognizing our interconnectedness, understanding that our well-being is intertwined with the well-being of others.
It's about letting go of that ego-driven need to be right or to be seen as superior, and embracing a more collaborative, compassionate way of being.
Beautifully put. And that brings us to another really important aspect of cultivating humility, which is addressing those inner challenges that can kind of get in the way.
You mean things like pride, self-doubt, insecurity? Those voices that can make it so hard to actually embrace humility.
Exactly. Saadi acknowledges the power of these internal forces, but he suggests that we approach them with self-compassion. So instead of judging ourselves harshly for having those thoughts, we can simply observe them, acknowledge their presence, and then gently redirect our focus back to our values, to that self of proximity.
It's like treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we would offer a friend who's struggling.
Precisely. And Saadi also emphasizes the importance of forgiveness, both forgiving ourselves for our mistakes and forgiving others for theirs. Holding on to resentment and anger only feeds the ego and prevents us from moving forward.
Forgiveness is definitely a tough one, but I see how it's so crucial for cultivating humility. It's about letting go of the need to be right, or to punish ourselves or others for past mistakes.
It is. It's about choosing compassion over judgment. And that choice, it has the power to transform our relationships and our experience of the world.
This conversation has been so eye-opening. It feels like Saadi is offering us this roadmap to a more meaningful and fulfilling life, a life that's rooted in humility, connection, and service.
And it's a journey we don't have to take alone. Saadi reminds us that we're surrounded by this community of seekers, people who are also striving to live in alignment with these values.
It's comforting to know that we're all in this together, that there are others who are navigating these same challenges and striving to embody these virtues.
It is. And that brings us back to the core of Saadi's message, which is that true humility isn't about diminishing ourselves. It's about recognizing our shared humanity, our interconnectedness.
It's about remembering that image of the ripe fruit bowing low, full of goodness, ready to share its gifts with the world.
Beautifully said. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one last thought from Saadi. He says, humility is the key to the Garden of Paradise.
That's a beautiful image to carry with us. And for all of you listening, I hope this deep dive into Saadi's wisdom has inspired you to unlock the door to that garden, to cultivate humility in your own lives, and to contribute to a more compassionate and connected world. Thanks for joining us on Wisdom Unveiled.